It started quietly. Teenage girls, one by one, began vanishing from a quiet, suburban neighborhood in Florida. It wasn't a dramatic disappearance, no ransom notes or frantic calls from desperate parents. Just silence. And with each missing girl, the terror grew. No evidence, no clues, and no reason. The community was in shock, utter disbelief that something so sinister could unfold in the place they'd called home for so long.
Welcome to Shocking True Crime. Thanks to all our viewers and subscribers for your support. Stay with us for daily updates on the most shocking true crime stories. Don't forget to subscribe.
They were a tight-knit group, where everyone knew everyone, and nothing ever seemed out of place. At first, it felt like random acts of fate, the kind of thing that happens on the edges of the world. But as time passed, something became clear: there was a common thread tying them all together. The missing girls had one place in common: the local church. A place where every Sunday, families gathered in faith. A place that should have been a sanctuary, but now, it was a site of horror. And no one knew that better than the people who had come to trust it the most. Enter Pastor Elijah Ward. A young man, charismatic, full of fire for God, and adored by the community. His passion was contagious, his words captivating. His youth ministry was thriving, and his influence spread beyond the church's walls. He was the model of a man devoted to faith, someone who gave everything to God. He spoke often about celibacy, about purity, how he refused to marry so he could serve God with undivided devotion. People admired him for that. To them, it was a sign of his piety, his dedication to the Lord's work. But what no one knew was that this vow of celibacy, the promise of purity, hid a far darker truth. Behind his words, behind the teachings, behind the warm smile he shared with every youth in his ministry, there lay a secret. A secret that would unravel the entire community. A secret that would shake them to their core. For 5 long years, the girls who disappeared were unknowingly being watched, their every move observed by the very man who had promised to guide them in faith. 5 years passed. For the parents of the missing girls, it was 5 years of agony. 5 years of unanswered questions. 5 years of waiting for closure that never came. But then, something changed. It was a violent storm, the kind that Florida knows all too well. Rain came down in sheets, flooding the church basement. Volunteers working late into the night, cleaning up the mess, began hearing something strange: faint cries. Muffled, desperate. At first, they thought it was just the wind, the storm playing tricks on their ears. But as the sound continued, they couldn't ignore it. It was too real. Too human. The volunteers, braving the storm's fury, followed the sound down into the basement, where they found something that none of them were prepared for. A section of the wall, recently sealed with fresh concrete, beckoned them. When they pried it open, the truth that lay hidden beneath the church was something they could never have imagined. Behind that wall was an underground labyrinth. Dimly lit rooms, each one locked away like a dark secret. The walls were lined with remnants of the missing girls: torn clothes, journals, hairbrushes, crosses hanging above each bed. These were the remnants of lives, of promises broken, of trust betrayed. And in the heart of it all was Pastor Elijah Ward, the man who had been baptizing souls, and yet, he had been luring those same souls into a nightmare. The screams, the cries for help that had echoed through the church's underground chambers, had been the sound of these girls, the ones who had once sat in pews beside their families, trusting the very man who had taken them. The sanctuary, a place of worship, was now the setting for unimaginable horror. What had been happening in the shadow of faith? The truth was far darker than anyone could have imagined. In the weeks that followed, investigators would uncover a web of lies, manipulation, and captivity, hidden in plain sight beneath the altar where people knelt in prayer, seeking solace. And when they finally confronted Pastor Elijah Ward, the chilling truth would unravel. But what could they say? Could they even comprehend how deep the betrayal went? How long had the darkness been festering beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect town? The answers were buried within the walls, beneath the floors, where the cries had finally been heard. And for the people of that quiet Florida neighborhood, the horror had just begun. The town of Springwood, Florida, was a place where everyone knew everyone. It was a small, tight-knit community, where Sunday service at the local church was the heartbeat of life. The church was more than a building, it was a sanctuary, a safe space where families gathered, friendships blossomed, and children were baptized into the faith. It was a place of comfort, where faith and trust were expected to protect them from the darkness of the world. But that world was changing, and something sinister was creeping in. One by one, teenage girls began vanishing. At first, it felt like an unsettling coincidence, just another tragic event that the community could write off as an unfortunate, but random, happening. But the disappearances soon became undeniable. No ransom calls, no signs of struggle. They simply disappeared, as if they had vanished into thin air. Their families were left in shock, unable to make sense of what had happened to their daughters. The police, too, were baffled, unable to find any solid leads. They combed through every possible scenario, questioning neighbors, friends, and family, but all they could find were empty, haunting questions. Interviews with parents revealed the desperation they felt as they searched for answers. Martha Hernandez, the mother of 16-year-old Sophia, spoke through tears. She was just a sweet girl. She always went to church, always helped with the youth group. Never gave us a second thought, and then, one day, she was gone. Her voice shook, but there was a quiet resolve in it too, a sense of wanting to find justice for her daughter. Jim Bailey, a father of one of the first missing girls, recalled his worst nightmare. The police kept telling us to be patient. That it could be anything. But I knew. Something wasn't right. I kept thinking about the church. They were always there, right at the center, watching over them. It never seemed like the right place for anything bad, but I couldn't shake the feeling. Detectives tried to connect the dots, but every lead seemed to lead nowhere. They followed rumors, traced possible sightings, and questioned every person the missing girls had been in contact with. But despite all their efforts, the mystery only deepened. Each disappearance was initially written off as an isolated incident. But there was a haunting pattern that began to emerge. All the girls had some connection to the local church, and the more the police dug, the more unsettling it became. The leaders of the church, particularly Pastor Elijah Ward, were brought in for questioning. He was a respected youth minister, known for his dynamic presence and spiritual guidance. He had been the one to counsel the girls, the one they all turned to in times of trouble. But as the weeks passed, the feeling in the town changed. The community began to grow uneasy. Their pastor, the one man they had trusted to guide them, was now under suspicion. But what did the parents know about him? What did the youth know about his relationship with these girls? Was it simply a matter of guilt by association, or was there something far darker beneath the surface? Pastor Ward had always been charismatic, the kind of man who could light up a room with his passion. His sermons were filled with fire, and his dedication to his ministry was undeniable. To the families, he was a leader, a spiritual guide. He was the one who helped them through difficult times, the one who showed the youth how to be good, moral people. His claim of celibacy and purity was seen as a holy dedication to God. In the eyes of the church, he was a model of devotion. But there were whispers. Small things. Strange things. Some parents, in the quiet corners of their homes, started to ask questions about the pastor. How well did they really know him? Did they truly understand the depth of his influence on their children? It wasn't just a suspicion, it was an eerie feeling that had taken hold of the community. The feeling that something wasn't right. One night, after a particularly fierce rainstorm, everything changed. Volunteers at the church were cleaning up floodwater in the basement, working into the early hours of the morning. The storm had done its damage, but as they shoveled debris and mopped up the mess, they heard something, faint, desperate cries. The sounds were muffled, but they were unmistakable. At first, they tried to dismiss it, telling themselves it was just the wind, the creaking of the old church walls, or the sound of water rushing through the pipes. But as the cries continued, they grew more persistent. They couldn't ignore it any longer. The volunteers, their hearts racing with fear, followed the sound down into the lower reaches of the basement. There, beneath the floorboards, they found a sealed wall, one that had been recently reinforced with concrete. The cries seemed to come from beyond that wall. Trembling, they called for help, and soon, the authorities arrived. What they uncovered was beyond anyone's wildest imagination. Behind the wall was a hidden underground chamber, dimly lit, cold, and oppressive. It was a maze of locked rooms, each one more horrifying than the last. The rooms were eerily decorated with symbols of faith, crosses hanging over each bed, broken and discarded possessions, and traces of the missing girls. Torn clothes, journals, and hairbrushes littered the floor. The girls had been here, living in this nightmare, hidden from the world, for who knows how long. The volunteers had uncovered the truth. The nightmare was real. Pastor Elijah Ward's promise of undivided devotion was not a vow of purity, it was a mask for something far darker. The man who had once stood before the congregation, preaching about faith, had been using his position of power to lure his victims, one by one, into the depths of his underground prison. The police were called immediately, but what they found would shock them to their core. The truth was now exposed. And as the cries faded into silence, the horror of what had been happening under their very noses became all too clear. When the investigators arrived at the scene, the chilling realization of what lay behind that sealed wall became undeniable. As the officers pried open the concrete, their flashlights pierced the darkness, illuminating a world that had been buried for far too long. Behind the reinforced barrier was a hidden underground complex, soundproof, dimly lit, and terrifyingly secret. It was a place where the missing girls had been held captive, isolated from the world, hidden beneath the very altar where they once sought refuge in faith. The walls were lined with remnants of the young girls' lives. Torn clothes, hairbrushes, journals, and photographs of their smiling faces before they had vanished all lay scattered across the grim chambers. Each room, eerily identical, was topped with a cross hanging above every bed, as if to further distort the sanctity of the place. These were not just rooms, they were prisons. The truth was buried deep beneath the church, where faith had once been a symbol of safety, now turned into a mask for horror. As investigators stepped inside, they realized just how meticulously Elijah Ward had orchestrated the girls' captivity. The rooms weren't just places to keep them confined. They were designed to keep them silent. The silence was not accidental, it was forced. The girls, who had once sat in the pews of the church, trusting in the very man who now held them captive, had been manipulated into believing they were safe. They had been chosen, he told them, to carry out a higher purpose. They trusted him completely, believing that they were fulfilling some divine calling. Investigators continued to search the rooms. Torn clothes, abandoned belongings, and the smell of years of confinement filled the air. But the most chilling discovery was found in the journals the girls had kept during their captivity. These journals, once filled with hope, now chronicled their torment. Each entry described the growing realization of what was happening to them, the psychological control they were under, and the ways they had been broken down by their captor. Photographs from the girls' last moments before they vanished were scattered about, each image frozen in time, smiles of innocence, unaware of the horror that lay ahead. The chilling contrast between those images and what had become of them in the underground complex was a brutal reminder of how faith had been twisted into something evil. Former youth members were interviewed, recounting how Elijah Ward had carefully chosen his victims. He watched them, one of the former members said, shaking their head as if still in disbelief. He watched their families, their routines. He knew who was vulnerable. He would study them, observe their habits, their weaknesses, and when the time was right, he would make his move. I don't think anyone ever suspected what was really going on. It was as if he knew exactly what he was doing, how to gain their trust, how to present himself as the devoted, selfless servant of God. To the parents, he was the mentor, the guide. To the girls, he was someone who promised safety, guidance, and support. He had cultivated an image of purity and virtue, all while manipulating those around him to serve his dark desires. He knew exactly how to exploit his position, using his authority as the pastor and youth minister to slowly, methodically take the girls under his control. As the stories unfolded, it became clear how expertly he had chosen his victims. He didn't rush, didn't act impulsively. He took his time, picking out the girls who fascinated him the most, those who were perhaps seeking guidance, those who looked up to him, trusted him without question. When he had them, they were trapped. There was no escape. The psychological manipulation that took place was staggering. Pastor Elijah Ward had convinced the girls that they were brides of the Spirit. They had been chosen for a higher purpose, he told them. Their suffering was part of God's plan. They weren't being held captive, they were fulfilling a divine mission, bearing pure children of God, as he so often put it. These girls, young and impressionable, had been made to believe that they were special, that their pain and suffering were part of something greater. Interviews with surviving victims revealed the full extent of the psychological control they had been under. Some of the girls had been kept for years. Others were pregnant, their bodies broken by the constant manipulation and torment. Some had children of their own, children fathered by the man who had sworn to serve God, yet had been living a double life of terror beneath the church. One survivor, her voice trembling, shared what she could remember: "I thought I was doing God's will. I thought I was meant to be there, meant to bear his children. I didn't understand it at first, but after a while, I knew something was wrong. I just couldn't leave. He made us believe we were the chosen ones." The full scope of Elijah Ward's twisted vision had come to light. What had once seemed like a harmless vow of celibacy was now exposed as a cover for the darkest of crimes. The girls had been victims, manipulated by a man they thought was their protector, their spiritual guide. In the depths of the church, hidden beneath the sanctity of prayer and worship, a horror had been unfolding, a horror that would change the town of Springwood forever. Pastor Elijah Ward was beloved by all. His presence was magnetic, a young man of faith whose passion for God seemed to shine from every word he spoke. His sermons were filled with hope and inspiration. He preached about purity, devotion, and sacrifice. His promises of eternal life, of spiritual fulfillment, comforted those who sought guidance in his words. He was a man who, on the surface, appeared to embody everything the community cherished. To the parents, he was the spiritual mentor they had always dreamed of for their children. He was the one they trusted to lead the youth, to show them the path to righteousness. And they believed it, wholeheartedly. His celibacy, his vow to remain unmarried, was seen as the ultimate sign of devotion to God. It was a sacrifice, a commitment that many admired. Little did they know, this vow was not a demonstration of holiness, it was a cover for something far darker. Church members spoke of him with reverence. Marie Duncan, a former member, recalls, "He was a man of God, always so devoted. He was always there for us, offering counsel and support. We trusted him like a family member." Detective Sam Weller, who had been involved in the investigation, recalls, "It was hard for the community to accept the truth. Everyone thought of him as a pillar of the church. He had used his position to gain their trust, to manipulate them." Pastor Ward's charisma and unwavering faith made it nearly impossible for anyone to see the darker side of him. Ward's reputation was built on the foundation of his selfless devotion. His vow of celibacy was seen as a sacrifice, a holy calling. But, in reality, it was a carefully crafted lie, a mask that hid his true intentions. He used his position, his ability to speak with authority, to convince the girls in his youth ministry that they were doing God's work. They were the chosen ones, he told them. He preyed on their vulnerabilities, offering them a place to belong, a sense of purpose that they may not have had at home. For many of them, this was everything they had been searching for: acceptance, love, a sense of value. But it came at a terrible cost. Pastor Elijah Ward had been a master of manipulation. Many of the girls he lured in had been struggling with their own personal demons. Some came from broken homes, others faced isolation and loneliness. Ward saw this vulnerability and seized it. He offered them sanctuary, a promise of something more, a promise that turned into a nightmare. "He made us believe that we were special," said Laura, a survivor who had spent 2 years trapped in the underground complex. "He told us we were chosen, that we had a divine purpose. And we believed him. I thought I was doing the right thing." It was this emotional and psychological manipulation that bound the girls to him. The victims had been convinced they were fulfilling a higher purpose, a mission that transcended their own suffering. The truth, however, was far from divine. Ward's twisted teachings, filled with religious rhetoric, turned the girls into tools for his own dark desires. They were not free, they were prisoners, emotionally and physically trapped by the man they had trusted. In the journals the girls kept during their captivity, their thoughts laid bare the horror they had been subjected to. Excerpt from one of the journals, he says, "We're the brides of the Spirit, that we must serve God by bearing pure children. I don't know what he means, but I feel like I'm losing myself. I miss my family. I miss being free." Another victim wrote, "Every day feels like a betrayal. He told me I was special, that I was chosen. But now, I don't know what I believe anymore. I feel trapped. I feel lost." These journals revealed the depths of the psychological hold Ward had over them. He had shattered their sense of self, manipulating their faith and their fears, turning them into mere shadows of who they once were. The emotional toll was immeasurable. The girls had come to him seeking guidance, but instead, they were led into a nightmare of captivity and psychological torment. It wasn't until another violent storm hit that the truth finally came to light. The heavy rain and wind swept through the small town, flooding parts of the church basement. Maintenance workers were tasked with cleaning up the water, but as they worked in the darkness, they heard something unsettling. It was faint at first, like a whisper in the wind, but then it became unmistakable, muffled cries. The workers froze, listening in disbelief. These weren't the sounds of the storm. These were human cries, desperate, filled with fear. They couldn't ignore it this time. They followed the sound, their hearts pounding as they moved deeper into the basement. The cries led them to the sealed wall, the one that had been so carefully hidden. With their hands trembling, they broke through the concrete, uncovering a horrifying secret that had been buried for far too long. What they found behind that wall would change everything. The news spread quickly, and soon, the police were on their way. Officers rushed into the church, their footsteps echoing through the quiet halls. But when they reached the sanctuary, they were met with something unexpected. Pastor Elijah Ward was standing at the pulpit, preaching as if nothing had changed, as if nothing had happened. The congregation sat before him, lost in their faith, completely unaware of the storm that was about to hit. The officers moved in, their presence overwhelming the room. Ward didn't flinch. He didn't try to flee or resist. He stood there, calm and composed, as if this was just another Sunday service. His eyes locked onto the officers, but there was no panic in him, no guilt. He continued his sermon, his voice steady, as if this was part of some divine plan. Interviewed later, one of the arresting officers recalled the scene. He stood there, calm, like nothing was happening. He didn't act like someone caught in a lie or facing the end of his freedom. It was like he genuinely believed he was above it all, as if he'd already been forgiven. It was chilling. For a man who had orchestrated such horrors, his composure was unnerving. As Elijah Ward was led away in handcuffs, his final words sent a chill through the room. "You can't imprison a servant of the Lord," he said, his voice almost serene. "I've already given them eternal life." It was a chilling statement, one that revealed just how deluded he had become. In his mind, what he had done wasn't a crime, it was divine work. His actions had been justified in the twisted framework of his mind, a belief that he was chosen to do God's will. As the officers escorted him out, flashbacks of the investigators' discovery in the underground chambers played out. The truth was now undeniable. The investigators had uncovered the full extent of his crimes. The hidden rooms, dark and suffocating, were filled with traces of the girls he had taken, some still alive, others barely surviving the years of abuse.
Welcome to Shocking True Crime. Thanks to all our viewers and subscribers for your support. Stay with us for daily updates on the most shocking true crime stories. Don't forget to subscribe.
Among them were pregnant women, some in advanced stages of pregnancy, their bodies showing the toll of what had been done to them. Some held babies, tiny lives born into a nightmare they would never escape. The investigators found it impossible to look away. The evidence was undeniable. DNA samples confirmed Elijah Ward's connection to the victims. He had fathered children with some of the girls he had abducted. His delusion had driven him to use faith as a weapon, manipulating his victims into believing they were chosen by God to bear his children. The horror of what had been happening in that church, beneath the sanctity of the altar where people prayed for salvation, was finally exposed. But for the victims, it had come too late. For the community, it was a truth they could hardly bear. What they had trusted, what they had believed in, had been used against them in the most unimaginable way. As the storm outside continued to rage, the town of Springwood was left to reckon with the nightmare that had been hiding in plain sight. The storm was over, but the damage it had caused would take far longer to heal. When the trial began, the public was in shock. The man who had once been a pillar of the community, beloved by all for his dedication to God, was now standing in the courtroom charged with crimes so unimaginable that the very idea of them was difficult to comprehend. Pastor Elijah Ward, the charismatic youth minister who had once led his flock with inspiring sermons and promises of divine purity, was now facing the consequences of his actions. The media quickly dubbed him the Florida Faith Dungeon Mastermind, and the label stuck. The images of his smiling face, once so full of compassion and warmth, were now juxtaposed with the horrific discoveries beneath the church. The truth had finally come out, and the world was left to grapple with the enormity of his betrayal. In interviews with lawyers, prosecutors, and the family members of the victims, the weight of the situation was clear. He was a predator, cloaked in scripture, one prosecutor said, his voice tight with emotion. He used the trust and faith of a community to hide his darkest desires. He knew exactly what he was doing, he manipulated, he deceived, and he stole the innocence of these young girls. For the victims' families, the trial was a bitter reminder of what they had lost. Martha Hernandez, whose daughter Sophia had been one of the first to disappear, spoke through her tears. He was supposed to protect them. He was supposed to help them grow, not to destroy them. The anger and disbelief were still palpable, as if the wounds were still fresh, despite the years of torment they had endured. As the trial progressed, the evidence against Ward was overwhelming. Forensic reports, victim testimonies, and even financial records detailing his use of church funds for the construction of the underground chambers all painted the same damning picture. The girls who had survived. Their captivity spoke about their emotional and psychological trauma, about how they had been manipulated into believing they were doing God's work. The courtroom was filled with heartbreak, as the depth of Elijah Ward's betrayal became painfully clear. When the verdict was finally read, it was a moment of both relief and sorrow. Elijah Ward was convicted on all counts: kidnapping, trafficking, and abuse. The charges, the gravity of the crimes, left the courtroom in stunned silence. The judge's final words echoed in the room: "This is an abomination of faith and humanity." A man who preached love and devotion, yet turned it into a weapon of control and harm. Ward, however, showed no remorse. As the sentencing took place, he remained eerily calm, almost detached. His face was void of any visible emotion, and when given a chance to speak, he quoted scripture, "The world hated me first." The words were chilling, as if he still believed that what he had done was justified, that he had somehow been chosen for this twisted mission. There was no sign of regret, no apology. For Ward, this was not the end, it was the fulfillment of what he had believed was his divine purpose. As the gavel fell, marking the end of the trial, Ward was sentenced to 5 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, along with an additional 120 years for trafficking and abuse charges. The court's decision brought some semblance of justice, but the emotional scars left on the victims and their families would remain long after the trial ended. The community of Springwood, once shaken to its core, now faced the aftermath of the nightmare that had been hidden right beneath their feet. The church was closed. The place that had once been the spiritual heart of the town, where families gathered to worship and seek solace, was now a symbol of tragedy. In the aftermath of Elijah Ward's capture and conviction, the building was no longer a house of faith, it had become a stark reminder of the consequences of misplaced trust. It was eventually converted into a memorial, a place to remember the lives that were lost, the innocence that was stolen, and the community that was forever changed. The memorial wasn't just a physical space, it was a living, breathing tribute to the victims, those who had suffered in silence, who had been manipulated and betrayed by a man they trusted, a man who was supposed to protect them, not destroy them. Visitors came to reflect, to mourn, and to learn. The town now understood what it meant when trust is weaponized, when a person in a position of power uses faith as a tool to control and exploit. It was a painful lesson, one that would stay with the community for years to come. The community, in many ways, would never be the same. The wounds were deep, and while justice had been served, healing was far from easy. There was no going back to the way things were before. People walked the streets with a quiet unease, their eyes constantly scanning, always questioning what they thought they knew. Could they ever truly trust again? Could they ever truly feel safe in a place that had been shattered by such a profound betrayal? The church, once a place of refuge, now stood as a silent witness to the horrors that had unfolded beneath its floors. It was a reminder of how faith, when manipulated, could lead to devastating consequences. As the years went by, the town struggled with the scars left behind. The emotional toll was felt by every family that had been affected, from the parents who lost their daughters to the survivors who now lived with the trauma of what they had endured. But even amidst the pain, there was a sense of resilience. The community came together to rebuild, to find healing, but they knew it would never be the same. How could it be? The final haunting image of the church lingered long after the memorial was established. The cross, once a symbol of salvation, now hung above the sealed church, its silent presence unyielding. It watched over the ruins of innocence and faith, a solemn reminder of what had been lost. For the community, the cross would always represent more than just a religious symbol, it would forever be a symbol of the betrayal that had unfolded in their midst. When holiness becomes the perfect disguise, who dares to look behind the light?
Welcome to Shocking True Crime. Thanks to all our viewers and subscribers for your support. Stay with us for daily updates on the most shocking true crime stories. Don't forget to subscribe.